Okay, hi everyone. I'm Louise Maynard-Atem. I am the research lead for Women in Identity, and today I want to talk about inclusion by design and how we go about creating identity solutions that work for everyone. So just switch monitors so I can change slides. There we go. So just before I get into that topic, just a very quick introduction to Women in Identity. It's for those of you who aren't familiar with us. So we started out life as a membership organization. We have around 1,100 members across 32 different countries. We have 32 different volunteer leads, and we historically have been focused on running events for the identity industry, trying to drive as much diversity and inclusion within the industry as possible. We're all volunteers in this organization, so I am the research lead, but my day job is actually the head of data insights for an identity and fraud organization called GBG, and the wider exec of the team are also volunteers as well, but all of our day jobs actually sit in the identity industry. So I think that gives us kind of a unique perspective in terms of how the industry works and where we can go about trying to improve situations in the identity industry. And the mission of our organization is effectively to inspire, elevate, and support a more diverse workforce so that the digital identity solutions that are intended for everyone are actually built by everyone. And as I mentioned, we historically have been an events-focused organization, but this year we're making the transition into doing our own sort of primary research, and that is the topic of today. So that first research that we're focusing on is what we're calling our conduct work, and that is all around ensuring that the digital identity solutions, particularly in the financial services sector, are fit for purpose for every citizen or consumer that they are designed to be serving. So a little bit of context of why this is important, although I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir with this audience, but effectively, humanity is diverse, and therefore identity and digital identity within that has to be as diverse as the citizens that it is designed to represent. And obviously we have the feature of intersectionality as well. So we have to be able to represent the multifaceted nature of individuals, and that needs to be represented in any kind of digital identity solution that we come up with. I suppose why we think this research is needed is that we as humans tend to solve for the problems that we understand or that we face in particular. So if we're having only one sort of type of person designing these solutions, and that type of person all has the same understanding of the issues and challenges, then we're only ever going to end up solving for those specific challenges and missing out a lot of the issues that a lot of other people face because they aren't really at the table when these solutions are being designed, and therefore their inputs and their thoughts aren't necessarily considered when the solutions are being designed. And too often, systems that we build for people are actually potentially blocking access to critical services and actually instituting other unintended consequences that we just haven't thought about, because those issues, those challenges that a broad range of people face were never considered at the design stage of a lot of these identity solutions. So that is why we as an organization have been focusing on this new phase of research called the Code of Conduct, which is intended to help organizations to understand where exclusion and bias can potentially creep into the design process of new identity solutions and try and help them course correct for that. Now, I've been following along with the discussions that have been happening over the course of today's session, of people talking about context in particular, and how we codify that context, but also that technology is potentially a key enabler, but only an enabler to the issues that we are trying to solve. And I wanted to use this quote that I pulled from the Women in Identity annual report from last year around the human element and inclusivity actually being key. And those are very much human problems. So technology can't really help us to solve those. So we need to be making sure that we are considering the humanity side of things and the inclusivity side of things far before we start to think about the technology that can help us solve these problems. Because like I say, technology is an enabler, but it doesn't help us to wrestle with some of these fundamental challenges that digital identity really has to take into account if it's ever going to be as useful as it can potentially be. So the other things, again, lots of areas that have already been touched upon in today's session, but sort of the potential impact of not designing or mandating for inclusion in digital identity solutions. So the first piece being around, no ID, no access. A lot of the digital identity solutions that are in existence today are predicated on, specific, usually government implemented or given documents. And if you don't have those documents, then effectively you could be rendered pretty much invisible from the any kind of digital identity system that gets implemented. So for all of those people who don't have the relevant and right documentation, and that could be people in a lot of different categories for a lot of different reasons, if they don't have those foundational documents, then they're effectively completely excluded from any other system that relies on having those documents to gain access. There is also then, once you've gained access, the issues around algorithmic bias and racial bias as well, because there's been very well documented cases of algorithmic bias and obviously favoring and disfavoring people of certain ethnic backgrounds, and we've got two examples in here of racial bias being specific. The image that you have on the right hand side is of someone submitting a photograph for getting a passport, and then the photo being rejected because the subject's eyes were closed. So in a lot of instances, in the way that systems are being built, they're not necessarily being purposefully built to exclude, but based off of a number of practices, whether or not that's the data that they are being fed with, or just the basic assumptions that they are based on, we are just excluding a lot of people. And I suppose what our work is trying to do is flag where these particular challenges might come into the process and help organizations to course correct for those. So that brings me on to the work that we're actually doing. So we realized that there is actually very little guidance on how best to tackle inclusion and bias in the digital identity sector. So there's a huge amount of really valuable work that has been done that talks about the problem and talks about the problem from various different kind of angles and aspects. But there is very little that then says, well, okay, how do we actually go about implementing change? So we understand that we have a problem. We understand that, we need to be as inclusive as possible in these systems that are increasingly becoming gatekeepers to society. But there isn't very much sort of pragmatic and practical advice on what do organizations that are building these digital identity systems actually have to do to make sure that they are taking into account the risks of bias and exclusion. So what we are trying to do through the work that kicked off in July is provide a practical and pragmatic approach to adopting a more diverse and inclusive approach to product development in particular. Our focus areas are digital identity within financial services, and the two focus markets that we've chosen are UK as being representative of a mature market and Ghana as being representative of an emerging market. Now, like I said, the work kicked off in July. We are delivering the work in conjunction with our research partner, Caribou Digital, and we have a number of sponsors that are funding the work. So in terms of how the project actually breaks down, so we have it's roughly in these 4 areas. So areas 1 and 2 are the pieces of work that are actually underway already, and I'll get into a little bit more detail of what that involves. And then the next phases of work will be the actual creation of the code of conduct, or the guiding principles that we want to share with organizations and have organizations sign up to. And then the 4th phase will be around implementation. So how do we, once we've created these principles for organizations to follow, how can we ensure that organizations are actually putting them into practice and sort of self-certifying that they are following through these principles? So those are the pieces of work where we're continuing to fundraise for, and they will start hopefully at the beginning of next year. So the areas of work that are already underway. So like I said, a lot of work has already been done in this space around defining what the problem is and providing evidence that the problem actually exists. So our first phase is a literature review, so a summary or a consolidation of the existing work that has been done for both mature markets and for developing markets as well. And then the second phase that is already underway is the impact of exclusion. So it's personifying what it actually means to be excluded from digital identity, with the specific lens of financial services. So it's going out there and it's talking to people that have actually been excluded and what that has meant for things that they can and can't do and how that's impacted their lives. So we are conducting interviews in Ghana in the UK, like I said, with individuals who have been excluded to really help us to understand what that means and how that impacts them as a person, how that impacts their life more broadly and their family situations, etc. We're also having detailed interviews with experts in both countries in the digital identity spaces and also in financial services, because we want to really understand the problem from both sides. So from those that are doing that are actually excluded and therefore can't access services, and those that are actually implementing the solutions, to understand how we've gotten to the place where we've gotten to. So how we are in a situation where people are being excluded, and what were the decision points that were taken that led to people being excluded, and therefore how can we make sure going forward that we can course correct for that so that it doesn't happen or persist in future. Now, the third area, which is all around, well, it started off being around how do we quantify the financial impact of exclusion? And we had a number of conversations with various potential collaborators to see what data was actually available and how could we, objectively measure this. And I suppose through the various conversations that we had, it was determined that, the data doesn't necessarily exist because it's very, very difficult to try and actually quantify, exclusion, let alone put a financial number on it. So now we're taking a slightly different approach to this work stream. And again, not kicked off yet because we are looking for partners to help us deliver this, but thinking about sort of a foundational econometric modeling route of how we would measure the impact of exclusion and what sort of data would we need to be collecting and how could we go about collecting that data. So instead of it being a summary in the way that the previous work stream is of how we've gotten to the position that we're in today, we're actually taking the route of, well, let's start here, start from this relatively blank page that we're on and start to collect the right kinds of data and then do the analysis based on the data that we can collect. Then we can start to benchmark organizations as to kind of, where they are in terms of inclusivity, and then start to collect the data on a regular basis. So we can come back and see how people have changed, how the situation has changed, how organizations have improved or not, and how then that becomes sort of the benchmark that we measure ourselves against. So rather than trying to force fit modeling that doesn't really accurately reflect what we're trying to capture, it's about coming up with a new model for doing this and then collecting the data over years so that we can start to benchmark ourselves. So very keen, particularly to hear from this group, either today or later, around how we could go about doing that and what sorts of models are already being built that could potentially be reused, and how we would go about collecting what data we need to collect and how we would go about collecting it so that we could have that sort of quantifiable measure. Because I think, things that get measured get done. And I think that would be really impactful and doesn't exist today. And then getting into the code of conduct itself. So taking everything that was on the previous slide and from the previous work streams as inputs, we want to actually develop a code of conduct or guiding principles so that organizations can have kind of a checklist of things that they need to be thinking through every time they are developing a new product or service, and making sure that at points where previously bias has crept into that process, they are able to course correct for that. So three different areas to this. So measuring, so having the conversations around where we are today, around how we've gotten to the point that we've gotten to today, consulting with people who are working in the industry. So we will be working obviously with the sponsors of this project, but also looking to open this out much more broadly so we can have very detailed stakeholder interviews, understanding what guidance would be appropriate to provide for people and how that can be implemented in their day-to-day roles. Because I think the challenge with anything like this is that we don't want to make it overly onerous for people to actually adhere to or abide by. We want to feed it as much into the day-to-day of people's jobs as we can, so that it just becomes something that they just do rather than something that they have to set aside and carve out specific time for, because I think that then leads to people seeing it as an extra or an over and above, and therefore lessens the likelihood that it will actually get done. And then the code of conduct work stream will culminate with a facilitated design sprint that brings together the various different stakeholders that we're working with, all of the inputs that from the previous work streams, so that we can collaboratively develop this code of conduct or these guiding principles. We then move into driving implementation of the code of conduct. So ultimately, I've included in here the sort of the user experience design process. What we want to do is overlay the code of conduct, the guiding principles, over processes that are already used in product development and product lifecycle management, so that people can sort of translate it into their everyday context. So this may be, if we look at the design process of what do we need to be thinking about from a diversity and inclusion and potential bias perspective at each of these phases in the design process or the product development lifecycle, and how can we be making sure that we're asking the right questions at each of these points to make sure that we aren't introducing or further bias or further excluding people with the products that we're developing. The last piece on this is around how we would drive uptake and adherence to the code of conduct as well. So currently we are contemplating a few different routes, whether we go down the self-certification route or whether we go down the sort of becoming a formal standard and sort of all of the other options that might sit in between each of those, because I think the strength of this work will be on whether or not it actually gets adopted. So we have some initial adopters in the sponsor organization, so they will immediately be the first people to be taking up the code of conduct, but that's only a small number of organizations. And this will succeed, and it will only succeed if we are actually able to drive greater adoption and drive other organizations to actually want to sign up to adhering to this code of conduct, and also sign up to sharing their progress and measuring themselves against what we're trying to do. So there's still to be defined as to how we will sort of drive implementation and adherence to the code of conduct. And again, always open to further input from collaborators on how best we do this, because I know we're not the first people to try and do this, so we want to make sure that we're learning from all of the things that have gone before us, any kind of best practice, so that we can get as greater adoption as possible. And so the last slide for me is around is a bit of a call to action or a request for support. So we're always looking for more collaborators. So we are working with Caribou Digital, as I mentioned, but I think this kind of work becomes even more valuable the more contributors you have to it. So the more collaborators that we have, particularly around sort of the econometric modeling, particularly around the development of the code of conduct itself, I think the work can only become stronger and be more valuable, and therefore more likely to be adopted. So always looking for more collaborators. So a bit of a call for this group that if you are interested in working with us on this, then please do reach out to me, because we're still at the formative stages of some of the work streams, and therefore still looking for collaborators to support us on this. And I think that was the last of my content. So thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. That's really wonderful. And it does link very directly to at least, well, I can think of 3 or more talks already. The exclusion of food subsidy in Uganda, proof of life in Brazil, access to a nightclub of vaccine status. I mean, this has stopped being contentious yesterday, but was in the UK, and also access to financial service in India. I mean, there's a whole bunch of these that have been touched on by multiple speakers. So so hopefully they will get in touch and join that up. I think it's often like in the area of human computer interaction, people worked on accessibility a lot. And it turned out that it's actually in the financial interest of organizations that build computing systems or digital systems, because it makes them more usable for everyone.
Yes.
And so if you make something that does inclusivity, or similarly with privacy by design, it's this by design thing is not a thing which only applies to a certain group. It's actually useful for the entire population. So I think so there's quite a few comments. So I don't think it's something that can translate to a direct question. There's several comments about risk. And I think this is one of the problems with this whole area, which is people have been designing digital ID systems. And I think it's where you choose a context like financial service, suddenly it becomes very clear, for example, who incurs which risks. And you choose a context like pension or government food subsidy or whatever, then you see who incurs which risk. If you try and design a system in the abstract with no use case, then it's impossible to determine that, and that becomes just a sort of arbitrary space. But then it's not clear how complex you need to make the system to prevent a risk because you don't know how big the risk is. That's sort of the question, I guess. If you're looking at a design and you didn't have a use case, then how would you compute the things like, if you think about sign-on systems where you have two-factor nowadays, they're much more complex, but that was because you're signing on to a system where you're risking losing money, or the bank is risking losing money. Whereas if you're, I don't know, just going to the tennis club or something, that's not really an issue.
Yeah. It comes back to the theme that we've been seeing a lot in the chat all throughout the day of context being key, and obviously it being different depending on kind of what's at stake almost. So yeah, definite theme throughout the day, I think.
And also that the context includes sort of multi-parties. So we had several situations where, of course, you have a identity verifier, but then they are in service to a financial service or a mortgage broker or whatever. And so suddenly you need to look about the complexity of multi-party systems and clarity, transparency about whose risk. So banks have often pushed risks onto customers. It's been a very standard practice in the UK for sure. So they've designed IT systems to reduce their cost and reduce their risk, but not necessarily your risk. So yeah, I think that's important. Anyway, I think, sorry, I've just talked us out of time. I think we should move on to the next talk. But thanks again for a really great talk, and I hope lots of people are going to join your activities. I think they're really great.